Japan, and continuing on from there. The U.S. had a fairly long-standing interest in Japan, dating back to the mid-19th century. So here you see a Japanese depiction of Commodore Matthew Perry, and he's credited for the opening up of Japan to the Western world. So Japan was largely isolated until this point, but the U.S. is really interested in having a greater influence over this region, partly because there's an American whaling industry, and you have Americans that are trying to whale off the coast of Japan, and they want to have a more of an understanding about the U.S. involvement there. They want to be able to very openly have an economic investment in this region. Also, you're going to have competition with other Western nations. So at this point, the British and French are increasingly monopolizing coaling stations to get more access to fuel throughout Asia. So Commodore Barry visits Japan twice, once in 1853, once in 1854. The second time he comes with a lot of support. So he visits Japan the second time, and he has 10 ships with him and 1,600 men. And so this is an example of something called gunboat diplomacy. So basically the idea of using military intimidation to try to have a further influence over a region. And it works because in 1854, the U.S. and Japan signed this treaty called the Treaty of Kanagawa. And what this does is it officially ends Japanese isolation, and it opens up ports for the U.S. to have access to Japan. And it also promises to protect U.S. sailors who were in Japan. So that's a huge change from the Japanese policy of isolation to a much more open economic relationship with the U.S. Also, there is sort of a cultural not cultural, but there's a huge source of tension between the U.S. and Japan in terms of how the U.S. is actually treating Japanese people within their own country. And so this is going to result in a gentleman's agreement in 1908. So what's happening is that in the U.S., there are discriminatory laws against Japanese Americans in California, just like there were against the Chinese. So this is going to cause some serious friction between the U.S. and Japan. One really prominent example of that is that in San Francisco, you had schools that were segregated. So basically, Japanese Americans couldn't go to school with white Americans. And this is seen as a national insult upon Japan. And so since, they already had this economic treaty, they kind of feel like it's not fair, obviously, for Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans to have, to be treated like inferiors. So in 1908, you're going to have this informal agreement between Teddy Roosevelt and Japan. And what it does is, on the one hand, Japan says it will agree to restrict immigration of Japanese workers to the U.S., but in exchange, Roosevelt has to persuade the California government to repeal its discriminatory laws. So basically, the idea is that the U.S. is kind of the U.S. is going to agree to stop treating Japanese Americans like second-class citizens, but at the same time, Japan is going to sort of try to alleviate the problem by making sure that there are less Japanese actually entering the country in the first place. Okay. The other thing that the U.S. is doing to further intimidate not just Japan, but other regions in Asia is that it, as we know, it's really built up its navy at this point. And so President Roosevelt tries to use U.S. naval power, again, to really intimidate these countries. And so between 1907 and 1909, Roosevelt's going to send this huge fleet of battleships called the Great White Fleet on an around-the-world cruise. And so the purpose of it was to demonstrate U.S. naval power. And it's aimed specifically at Japan, but again, other Asian nations. And the idea is, it's sort of, again, gunboat diplomacy. The idea, Japan obviously is going to take notice of this strong U.S. Naval power. And in a way, they kind of feel like, okay, if they're not going to enter into agreements via treaties, that the U.S. might use military means to increase its influence over Japan. In 1908, you're going to have an agreement between the U.S. and Japan again. It's called the Root-Takahira Agreement. It was negotiated between the U.S. Secretary of State, Elihu Root, and the Japanese ambassador, Takahara. And what it does is it pledges a mutual respect for each nation's Pacific possessions And it also is going to support the open door policy in China, which we're going to talk about in a little while. So again, that's a further, in addition to the Treaty of Kanagawa that we just talked about, this is another agreement where you see a greater understanding between the U.S. and Japan. And you can see that the U.S. obviously is going to have greater influence over Japan at this point. Another thing is that the U.S. wants to place a limit on Japanese influence over Western territories. So this is exemplified in the Lodge Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in 1912. And so Henry Cabot Lodge was a senator, a Republican from Massachusetts. And the problem that he's experiencing is that there's this group of Japanese investors who are trying to buy a large part of Mexico's Baja Peninsula. And Henry Cabot Lodge sees this as a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. And so he adds this corollary to the Monroe Doctrine that says any non-European power, like Japan, would be excluded from owning territory in the Western Hemisphere. And what's interesting is actually President Taft opposes this corollary because, first of all, he knows that it offends Japan. And then secondly, it's going to severely anger Latin American countries as well. So, this shows us that the U.S. is increasingly flexing its muscle over these regions, which doesn't necessarily always breed respect among outside nations. This cartoon called The Imperialist Tailor shows the Tailor himself is supposed to be President McKinley, and this is Uncle Sam. And Uncle Sam, as you can see, is very obese. So basically, this shows us that McKinley is trying to measure Uncle Sam for larger clothing because, you can see that as he becomes increasingly invested in the imperialistic game, he's becoming bigger, right? And then these people over here on the left, they're all anti-imperialists. So you have Joseph Pulitzer, for example, and they're all trying to offer Uncle Sam a weight loss elixir. So you see that there's this sort of imperialistic push versus the anti-imperialistic push. So what you see here is that, as the nation is expanding its imperialistic presence, many people, like Pulitzer, are going to be worried that the U.S. is growing too big for its own good. Okay, so let's talk about the U.S. role in Cuba, and then we'll probably put a stop to this video and start with a new one. And so, again, you're going to see the U.S. take a greater role in the Caribbean. What's happening at this point is that Cuba is still ruled by Spain at this point, but the U.S. and other countries are becoming increasingly aware of a very abusive relationship between Spain and Cuba. This cartoon shows us the text down here says the duty of the hour to save her not only from Spain but from a worse fate. And so the fear is, on the one hand, that if the U.S. continues to allow Spain to rule Cuba, that the people are going to experience this sort of despotism that's going to violate their civil rights, essentially. And the other fear is that if the Spanish are deposed for whatever reason, that when left to their own devices, the Cubans may not necessarily make the wisest decisions for how to structure their government. So the U.S. doesn't just want to get rid of the Spanish influence over Cuba. They want to replace Spain as the influencer of Cuba. So there are a number of things that are going to justify the U.S. involvement in Cuba. One of them is the very abusive way that you see Cuban people treated by Spanish rulers. And so there's going to be a revolt in Cuba, actually a couple of them. One of them takes place between 1868 and 1878, and then another one starts in 1895 and continues on until Cuban independence. And so what you have Cuban nationalists who are trying to fight to overthrow Spanish rule. So they actually are doing things like sabotaging and laying waste to Cuban plantations to try to weaken the Spanish economic influence over Cuba. But Spain retaliates by sending a very autocratic general, a guy named Valeriano Weyler, as well as about 100,000 troops to try to crush the revolt in Cuba. And so what Weyler does is he basically establishes these internment camps for Cuban civilians. They call this the reconcentration policy. So it very much is like concentration camps, and tens of thousands of Cubans are going to die due to starvation and diseases. The American press, once they get wind of this, they're going to call Weyler the butcher. Another reason why the U.S. is becoming increasingly interested in Cuba is because of two things: this phenomenon of yellow journalism and also this idea called Jingoism. So let's take them one step at a time. Yellow journalism is sort of exaggerated press coverage. In this instance, it's used to promote war fever. So basically, yellow journalism is very sensationalistic reporting. It tends to feature really bold and lurid headlines of crime, disaster, and scandal. In a way, I like to think, when you're in line at the grocery store and you see those tabloid magazines, kind of think of that. The point is it's trying to arouse people's emotions, even if it's not necessarily true. There are two very well-known contributors to yellow journalism. You have Joseph Pulitzer up above. His publication was called The World, and then William Randolph Hearst, whose publication was called The Journal. And again, they're printing really exaggerated and false accounts of the Spanish atrocities in Cuba. And so because Americans read these things, they're going to increasingly urge Congress and the president to intervene in Cuba for humanitarian reasons. And then you have Jingoism. And Jingoism is basically an intense form of nationalism calling for an aggressive foreign policy. So U.S. expansionists are going to demand, the Jingoism, an example of it is that U.S. expansionists are going to demand that the U.S. takes its place with other imperialist nations of Europe as a world power. So Jingoism is also demonstrated by intense competition with other imperialist nations. The important thing to realize is that not all American politicians support the idea of Jingoism or imperialism for that matter. So the Democratic President Grover Cleveland doesn't like Jingoism or doesn't like imperialism. William McKinley in the early stages of his presidency was also against imperialism, but we'll see how these sensations like yellow journalism are actually going to change his mind, and he's going to get involved in war with Spain. But both of these people, Grover Cleveland and William McKinley, feel like military action was both morally wrong and also a bad idea economically. The cartoon right here, you see, this is basically, this is Pulitzer, this is Hearst. They're both, the idea is that they're both using the press to create a war. Okay, another thing that is contributing to this U.S. involvement in Cuba and just the U.S. war with Spain is the Delome letter. And so Dupuy Delome was the Spanish minister to the U.S., and he writes a letter that was leaked to the press and printed on the front page of William Randolph Hearst's journal. And so the letter is very highly critical of President McKinley, and it's considered an official insult against the U.S. national honor. So this is also really going to fuel anti-Spanish sentiment among the U.S. And again, since it was printed in the journal, all American civilians have access to this, and they're going to be increasingly enraged with Spain, and they're going to put more pressure on the U.S. government to do something about it. Teddy Roosevelt also is very much in support of U.S. intervention in Cuba and U.S. war with Spain. At this point, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy under William McKinley. He is very much unlike McKinley. He's an imperialist. He's an American nationalist. He criticizes William McKinley's foreign policy. He says that it's weak. And then he actually resigns from his post specifically to fight in Cuba to work for Cuban independence. So that really shows us how involved he is in imperialism. The U.S. volunteer cavalry in Cuba under Teddy Roosevelt's leadership was called the Rough Riders. So you see them here. You see Teddy Roosevelt presiding over them in both of these images. And you see that, obviously, this is really glorifying Teddy Roosevelt's involvement in Cuban independence. And to a certain extent, his involvement here, obviously, is going to increase his reputation as a strong military leader. And that's one of the reasons, of course, why Teddy Roosevelt is going to eventually become a very powerful leader and president. So, this combination of yellow journalism and, oh, you know what? I'm sorry, I just skipped a slide. The last reason why the U.S. can justify going to war with Spain is because of this, the sinking of the USS Maine. So the USS Maine was a naval ship that was anchored in Havana, Cuba, and it explodes, and 260 Americans on board are killed. This happens about a week after the Delon letter, so there's already really anti-Spanish sentiment to begin with. And what happens is that the yellow press is immediately going to accuse Spain of blowing up the ship. Actually, many historians believe that the explosion was an accident, but nonetheless, because it happened so close to the Delon letter and because U.S. sentiment against Spain is already so strong, it's easy for them to blame it on the Spanish, and it's yet another reason to go to war with Spain. And so McKinley is finally convinced. After the Maine, McKinley issues an ultimatum to Spain demanding for a ceasefire in Cuba. Spain actually agrees to the ceasefire, but at this point, the press and Congress are still very much pushing for war. So McKinley actually didn't really want to go to war, but all these different pressures are going to cause him to yield, and he finally sends a war message to Congress. And so what he asks, he says, first of all, that the U.S. needs to put an end to the barbarities, bloodshed, starvation, and horrible miseries in Cuba. He also calls for the U.S. to protect the lives and property of the U.S. citizens that live in Cuba. He also calls for the end of the very serious injury to the commerce, trade, and business of our people in Cuba. And he also calls to end the constant menace to our peace arising from disorder in Cuba. And so the official agreement to go to war was called the Tailor Amendment. I don't think I have a slide about that. But what the Tailor Amendment says is it's Congress's joint resolution to authorize war with Spain. It declared that the U.S. had no intention of taking political control of Cuba. And then it also stated that once peace was returned to Cuba, that the Cuban people would control their own government. So the idea is that the idea is that the U.S. is not trying to actually occupy or rule Cuba, that they just want to establish independence. And this is going to gain more Cuban support, obviously. The Spanish-American War itself is very short. It's nicknamed a Splendid Little War because the U.S. achieves victory after just 10 weeks. The fighting begins in the Philippines, which, as you know, was also controlled by Spain at this point. Teddy Roosevelt, we know his military role up to this point. He sends a large all-steel naval fleet to the Philippines, and this easily defeats the Spanish fleet. And also, there are going to be Filipino rebels in the Philippines who are trying to fight against Spanish rule, and they team up with the U.S. And by August 13th, they successfully capture Manila. So that the Filipino front is over relatively quickly. So this is just a newspaper image of the capture of Manila. So obviously celebrated, promoting a lot of American nationalism. And then the war continues in Cuba. So the invasion of Cuba was a little bit more difficult than the invasion of the Philippines, and it was mainly due to climate conditions in the Philippines. And so actually you're going to have more than 5,000 American soldiers die of conditions like malaria, typhoid, and dysentery. And fewer than 500 American soldiers are actually going to die in battle. Again, just like in the Philippines, the U.S. forces are going to join forces with Cuban revolutionaries, and their joint effort is going to fairly easily defeat the poorly led Spanish army. So if it weren't for the climate conditions, this fight would have been much easier. The U.S., because of its strong navy at this point, easily destroys the Spanish fleet at Santiago Bay. So Spain essentially loses all of its naval control over Cuba, and it officially asks the U.S. for peace in August of 1898. So actually, the Filipino front and the Cuban front are happening at the same time. So I know we've had a million treaties of Paris, so not to confuse you yet again, but the peace treaty that ends the Spanish-American War is also called the Treaty of Paris. This is a really controversial treaty. In fact, it was actually more controversial than the war itself. The beginning part wasn't controversial. It recognized Cuban independence. So that was good for the Cubans. But then the controversial parts come. The U.S. also gets 2 Spanish islands in the deal. It gets Puerto Rico and Guam, which is in the Pacific. It also says that the U.S. can acquire the Philippines if it makes a $20 million payment to Spain. And so a lot of Americans are worried about this because they don't know if it's a good idea to take over such a large Pacific nation as a colony. Actually, staying here for a second. So basically, there's going to be a huge division in public opinion about basically between imperialists and anti-imperialists. Anti-imperialists are making the claim that this is the first time that the U.S. would be taking possession of a heavily populated area whose people were of a different race and color, or and culture rather. They argue that taking over the Philippines would be a direct violation of the Declaration of Independence because it would be depriving Filipinos of the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Obviously, imperialists are going to argue that the Declaration of Independence doesn't apply to Filipinos. There's also going to be an argument that U.S. Takeover of the Philippines would entangle the U.S. in all the other political conflicts in Asia. And you see how controversial this treaty is because it's only approved 57 to 27 in the Senate, which is just one vote more than the 2/3 majority needed to ratify. So if 2 more senators voted against this treaty, it wouldn't have occurred. The other thing is that the Filipinos actually rapidly turn against the Americans. We know that during the Spanish-American War, the Filipinos and the U.S. Were very much collaborating with one another to get rid of Spain, but very quickly afterwards, the Filipino nation realizes that the U.S. is trying to exploit it. And so the Treaty of Paris sparks outrage in the Philippines, and you're going to have a short war between the Philippines and the U.S. So, those Filipino nationalists who had just fought alongside Americans in the Spanish-American War are now leading bands of guerrilla fighters against U.S. controls. It's going to be a tough fight. The U.S. troops actually take 3 years to put down the insurrection. It gives you a sense of how successful guerrilla warfare is. But in the end, 1 in every Filipinos had been killed, and ultimately, as we know, the U.S. controls the Philippines thereafter. And they continue to control it until 1946, when there is officially Filipino independence. So, like I've been saying, there is an increasing opposition to imperialism, and this manifests actually the same year that the Spanish-American War, actually the year after the Spanish-American War takes place. The American Anti-Imperialistic League is going to be founded in 1899. It's going to be led by William Jennings Bryan. You should know that name because he ran against McKinley for president in 1896. Also, you see other names that may, to a certain extent, some of them may be surprising to you, like Andrew Carnegie belonged to the Anti-Imperialistic League, and they are very much against the annexation in the Philippines. So, I mean, it's important for us to realize that there was U.S. opposition to imperialism, but ultimately, obviously, the expansionists prevail. What's interesting is that after the Spanish-American War, there's this question about whether the U.S. Constitution actually applies to territories like the Philippines and Puerto Rico. And so there's going to be a series of Supreme Court cases that are called the Insular Cases, and they all rule that constitutional rights do not automatically apply to territorial possessions. And they also rule that only Congress has the power to grant such rights to the territories. And so this obviously is very disappointing for people who live in places like Puerto Rico, the Philippines, because they know that, okay, on the one hand, they were technically liberated by the U.S., but on the other hand, they're not treated like U.S. citizens. So this is clearly problematic. Let's talk about Cuba. Cuba establishes independence after the Spanish-American War. But Cuba, when it writes its constitution, realizes that the U.S. is going to put significant pressure on it to ultimately give the U.S. special privileges in Cuba. So there's this agreement at first that the U.S. and Cuba, this agreement, let me backtrack. The really significant thing that we see that shows U.S. influence over Cuba is the Platt Amendment, which is tacked on to the U.S. Constitution. And what it says is that, first off, Cuba had to agree to never sign a treaty with a foreign power that impaired its influence, or independence, rather. It also says that Cuba agreed to permit the U.S. to intervene in Cuba's affairs to preserve its independence. So that's sort of an extension of the Monroe Doctrine, written right into Cuba's constitution. It also says that Cuba had to agree to allow the U.S. to maintain naval bases in Cuba. One of the really important things is that this is when the U.S. establishes a permanent base in Guantanamo Bay. And we know that this has significant impacts on the future of the U.S. So this amendment is tacked on to Cuba's constitution, but Cuba is very reluctant to do this because ultimately what happens is that now U.S. foreign policy is subject to U.S. oversight and control, and this remains in effect until Fidel Castro orchestrates the Cuban revolution in 1959. So basically you have, even though Cuba is independent, it's really significantly controlled by the U.S. still, which kind of goes against, obviously, some of the earlier attitudes about imperialism that basically said that it should be more of an economic and diplomatic relationship and not a military one. All right, let's talk about Puerto Rico and then we'll take a break. Puerto Rico was also very much of interest to the United States. And what you have is that in 1900, Puerto Rico is going to become an unincorporated territory. This is due to the Foraker Act. But what the Foraker Act also says is that Puerto Ricans remain citizens of Puerto Rico and not the United States. The Foraker Act is also going to impose import duties on Puerto Rican goods. So you see that even though Puerto Rico becomes subject to U.S. control at this point, the Puerto Ricans are still not considered U.S. citizens in any way. As we know from the previous slide, the Insular Cases do not give any constitutional rights to Puerto Rican citizens. And also what the Insular Cases do is they affirm the legality of the import duties on Puerto Rican goods. So basically you see that even though the U.S. controls Puerto Rico, it's still treated like a foreign nation, and import tariffs are going to discourage trade between the U.S. and Puerto Rico. But in 1917, the U.S. approach towards Puerto Rico is going to change a little bit. You're going to have a 1917 act of Congress called the Jones Act. And what this does is it does grant U.S. citizenship to all inhabitants of Puerto Rico, and it provides for limited self-government. So this is going to essentially overturn parts of the Foraker Act. It also gives full territorial status to Puerto Rico. It removes tariff duties on Puerto Rican goods coming into the U.S., so this is going to stimulate more trade between the U.S. and Puerto Rico. It's also going to set up the ability for Puerto Ricans to elect their own legislatures and also their own governors to enforce local laws. But there are still some restrictions on Puerto Ricans' constitutional rights. So, for example, still to this day, actually, Puerto Ricans cannot vote in U.S. presidential elections. And so what happens instead is that Cuba is able to send a resident commissioner to Washington, and that allows them to vote on behalf of Puerto Rico in the House of Representatives. But that's really the only influence that Puerto Rico has over the federal government. Other than that, Puerto Rico still is, it's this weird thing where it's almost like a U.S. colony. It really never was incorporated like a true member of the United States. Even though people who are born in Puerto Rico are considered U.S. citizens, they still have a lot of limitations. Let's take a break and we'll pick up with Panama.